Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to talk for this great audience. Well, let me just introduce myself a little bit. My name is Leandra Gonçalves. My main background is on biology, and I did my master's on ecology and animal behavior. But after my master, I got a little bit frustrated with the academia world and scientific papers and qualis and something that we have to keep publishing every day. And I decided to move and work on environmental NGOs. And I did that for 7-8 years. And this gave me the opportunity, because I was a little bit frustrated with the science and policy interface, because most of my research work during my monography and my master's were always stating something like, I'm doing this research because I want to contribute with the biodiversity conservation. And at the end, I felt that my work were stuck in a library, nobody was reading, and I was not really contributing with the conservation I was wishing to. So I say, let's try the environmental NGOs and see if I can help to build a bridge between the science and policy. I did that for that 7-8 years. I worked for a while for Greenpeace, and I work also for SOS Mata Atlântica Foundation, which is the largest environmental NGO we have here in Brazil. It was a very good experience for me, because I could work on the policy side. I could follow up many environmental multilateral agreements, and I was there with my biology background trying to understand why the policymakers were not looking into the huge knowledge universities were producing to take their decisions. And this was a question that were following me during these 8 years, doing advocacy work on International Whaling Commission, Convention of Biological Diversity, or UNFCCC, IPCC meetings. And after a while, I decided that I should go back to the university and see if I could study why those agreements were not being effective, why they were not listening to the science that we have available for them. I searched for many universities and departments for doing this, and the best one for me was international relations. So I got my PhD on international relations at the University of São Paulo. And I was like a very weird person there, because everyone was studying trade, financial, monetary funds, and I was there studying regional fishery management organizations. But at the end, it was a very interesting exchange information between all those lawyers and political scientists, social scientists, and it was a great experience for me. So today, I'm pretty much interested in understanding science and policy interface and how we can work to make power listen to science, which was the main subject of my PhD. But as you have heard yesterday from Cristiana and from Pedro Jacob, the world is very complex. So imagine that we are in this room, and besides we have many interests in common, because we are here studying oceans, so we have something that moves us to be here together. We have many different values, many different beliefs, and it would be very hard to take one consensus decisions here. Yesterday, someone mentioned that, I guess was Jake, that we can spend like in a UN meeting, United Nations meeting, like 12 hours to have 2 pages agreed between the members. So I'm sure we would have this here too. So we have heard a lot of complexity. The world is complex. The oceans is complex. And we have this, like, if we multiply for 7 billion, yes, the world is much more complex than we can ever imagine. So I would like to start my call asking if you have heard about the Anthropocene. Does anyone have heard about Anthropocene? Please can raise your hand. Okay, so we can see by that that Anthropocene is a very popular word that we have now in this environmental research and conventions, agreements realm. What is the Anthropocene? Well, first of all, we had living in the Holocene period, which is a geological period for around 11,000 years, and it was the most stable geological epoch we have lived for. It was when the mankind developed many of the things we have now for living. And then some research starting noticing that probably since the Industrial Revolution, we are producing so many different things that those things we are producing are provoking marks in the layers we have in the earth. And that would be enough evidence to classify as a new geological epoch. But this is not really a consensus between the academic and scientific world. There are many people that don't simply agree that we are living the Anthropocene, that just the Earth is passing through a very different period, as we have done in the glacial period. So it's not really a consensus. There are some research that don't really agree. There are some of them that don't really think we are living in the Anthropocene. All this discussion starts a little bit before Crutzen and the Stormer paper, when they were discussing the Anthropocene. And when they published this piece on Nature saying that geology of mankind with some evidences that we are living in the Anthropocene, and that amount of CO2 emissions we were throwing on the atmosphere were really changing the planet we are living on. So the question is still here, are we living in the Anthropocene? So we have here a picture with some geological epochs that we have passed through along those years. Well, not really us, but our antecedents. And after the Holocene, we were living in a place or in a geological epoch where human beings are making dramatic changes in our planet. Even people don't really agree about if we are living in Anthropocene or not, the term and the concept got really popular. And when I was preparing this talk, I got impressed at how popular the term is. Not only for us in this room or for the scientific papers we have to read, because it's almost a tag. If you put like, I want to study oceans in the Anthropocene, coastal communities in the Anthropocene, ocean governance in Anthropocene, so then you are part of Anthropocene community. But not only on science. We have this very popular cover for The Economist, where most of readers of this magazine are not really on the scientific community, but they will now get to know what Anthropocene means and what they are, probably their business or their action were doing to the planet. Not only in the magazines, we have now Tshirts, Anthropocene. So you get to know how Anthropocene is popular when you have T-shirt Anthropocene. You can buy from the internet if you want. You have some jokes about being on the Anthropocene. So Anthropocene gets very popular. So you can like, welcome to the fabulous Anthropocene era. And this was a sign in a universe where they were joking with the students. Or you have cartoons on main newspapers saying, welcome to the Acidification. You just want to know what the temperature is. So you know when a term is going to a new wave of knowledge, when the term is influence many different peoples, where it goes beyond the scientific community for the general public. And Anthropocene is the new one. We had some words before, like sustainable, ecology, or even environmental. When you talk, when you go to the lift with your neighbor that you have never seen in your life and say, oh, yes, we are living in the Anthropocene. This is the kind of lift and elevator you can talk to your neighbors. And now, for my surprise, we have a romance book, Love in the Anthropocene. So yes, Anthropocene is very popular. Yeah, after all, we can reflect what is love in the Anthropocene. But of course, in the academia is where the place to debate and reflect on Anthropocene is the really one. And not only on the natural science point of view, but also social scientists needs to discuss what Anthropocene means for the complex world we live now. I was in the Environmental Studies Center 2 months ago, and I watched a lecture from Professor Thomas Lewinson, which is from the Biology Institute at Unicamp. And he mentioned that he was talking to Stuart Ping, which is a very proeminent biologist, and he told them, I hate the term Anthropocene. Anthropocene, for him, it obfuscates a simple statement that human actions now change planetary process. So for some research, Anthropocene means nothing. We are just obfuscating a process. We are just changing something that is natural and that is part of our development. But no matter what, we have now a journal, which is the Anthropocene Review, where people who want to research and link their research on Anthropocene are publishing. And for the oceans, we have many papers on this matter, talking how we can govern the oceans in the Anthropocene. And of course, if I could bring here for you some examples of it for the past 10 years, that would be too much. So I decided to bring some examples of Anthropocene research for the oceans that was just for 2018, and not all of them. So we have this Anthropocene sea level change, a history of recent trends observed in the US, is Gulf. We have coastal systems in the Anthropocene. We have framework for understand marine cosmopolitanism in the Anthropocene. So people are really linked to the term in a way to study and to understand that we are looking to an area, we are looking to answer a research questions in a period where human beings, or the way we are developing, are provoking dramatic changes in our biological and social systems. This is the main message that Anthropocene wants to send us. How we govern a planet, how we govern an ocean that is within a dramatic change that is caused by human. And we have this, which is from many colleagues of mine, including Leopoldo, which is Ocean Governance in the Anthropocene, and he will be talking with us after the break. So the term got very popular, as we could see, T-shirts, cartoons, jokes, and in research we have many people working on it, basically to discuss how we can govern the oceans under this new period. For me, it really doesn't matter if, because formally, Anthropocene is not yet a geological epoch, because to become a formal geological epoch, it has to be approved under an intergovernmental geological conference that there is no consensus yet that we have changed from Holocene to Anthropocene. But for me, it really does not matter if we are in a new formal geological epoch. For me, what matters is that we have enough evidence to show that we are facing a lot of changes in the planetary scales. And of course, we have this very famous and well-known, do you know this paper from Hockström and collaborators from 2009, where he talks about the planetary boundaries we have in the world? Do you know this paper? Does anyone know this paper? Many of you? Okay. He just published a new one with his same colleagues, and it's 2018, which is he's talking about the trajectory of Earth system governance for this Anthropocene, for the PNAS. So I strongly recommend you read this. Maybe after all, I can send Luciana this new paper, and we can send to all of you by email. But this was a breakthrough research that he was saying, hey, we have to look into these boundaries we have here. Maybe it's better if I stand here. But we have to look to all these boundaries that we maybe have some research on it, but when we put all together, we say that we need to identify and quantify planetary boundaries that must not be transgressed to prevent that human activities from cause an acceptable environmental change. So it's very related to how we can live in a planet with safety. How human beings can still live in a planet where we have chemical pollution, climate change, ocean acidification, the depletion of ozone layer, or nitrogen and phosphorus, global freshwater use, change landing use, biodiversity loss. And from this work that has been published in 2009, and then another one, and they are in a third version of the Planetary Boundaries debate, where here in the first one he showed that biodiversity loss, climate change, ocean acidification, and nitrogen and phosphorus cycle were really over the boundaries, and that we should take care of it if we want to keep a safe space for humanity in the planet. And we have enough evidences for the oceans as well, because ocean acidification is under lots of uncertainty, because it's something that is not visible for human eyes, and we still have to do a lot of scientific research to understand what is ocean acidification, and what is the impact of ocean acidification in the food web chain we have in the ocean. And this is very much complex. But not all of this. When we see some papers like this, impacts of biodiversity loss on ocean ecosystem for bodies warming in 2006, we can see that we have some evidence from one research or another with one methodology, one approach different from the other one, but we have enough evidences to see that we have decline on species richnesses. We have marine deformation. So in this Douglas Macaulay paper with some colleagues, they could show that we were following the same path that terrestrial environmental has suffered in the past, but for the oceans we were not yet reaching the tipping points. So we could reverse the scenario. We could see this loss of coral cover or the loss of mangrove area that was really increasing along the years. And he showed that many development factors were really increasing too. So the oceans were becoming the new conflict territory, or sea territory, as we want to show, because it is facing the same trajectory than terrestrial environmental, the same conflicts between environmental and development. And how we can harmonize uses and conservation, or how can we try to keep or stabilize the situation and the context we have in the world right now. And here he shows that we have an increase in the number of marine wind turbines, or the increasing, and this is really scary, on the seabed mining, or the increasing on container traffic that is also over the oceans, and also, this is very sad, the increase on number of dead zones in the oceans. And this is because, and that's why we are discussing now the global governance of the oceans, because most of these impacts or problems we have in the oceans are not only in the sphere of nations to be resolved. It's different from the continental area. Some problems we have in the continental area, one state, one country like Brazil can solve, but ocean is pretty much interconnected, is integrated, and the problem we have in the oceans are not only a problem for Brazil, it's a problem of all nations, and that's why we have to treat them under a global governance of the oceans. And here I can bring some examples like migratory species, turtles, tunas, whales. They are not only in Brazil, they migrate between areas. So it doesn't matter if Brazil is doing this homework. It matters if all countries are together doing their homework to protect these species. Or we have this increase on wind turbines, increase in CO2 emission. If Brazil is not doing good for emissions, he's not doing good for the small islands as well. Because once we are increasing our emissions, we are also creating problems for the islands nations. So the world has become much more integrated, mainly in the ocean's helm, because we have this currency that connects us all. And not only on the impact side that we know very well. We are in a community that we can say, okay, we have environmental impacts, and it disconnects us all. We have migratory species, and we know turtles, whales, and fishes, and we know they go around the oceans. But we have also trade. And trade is each day, each year, becoming even, going even further. So we have this map that shows global maritime traffic flows that's going to one country to another in a daily basis. And they are also bringing invasive species, they are also going through pollution, marine litter, and they are also part of these complex systems that we aim to study. We have also fishery, and this is a snapshot I took yesterday night from the Global Fishing Watch. So at the time I was preparing my talk, and fishing was all around the global ocean, doing their business, and they are also fishing species that are migratory. So this also connects the ocean to something that we are now discussing, the global governance of the oceans. So at this point, we have discussed with Pedro Jacobi, with Cristiana, with Jake, what is the governance? And here, today, after, well, we are in the third day, you already know what governance means. And also you know before you came here, because you use governance for most of the works, at least for the ones I saw here yesterday in the poster sections. So we have here the oceans governance, and I am focusing more on a global scales. And in the global scales just add more complexity, but it's not different from the local scale. So for the ocean governance, we have stakeholders, actors that are involved in this arena. So we have states, which are the countries who normally attend United Nations meeting, international organizations meeting, and they have the power to take decisions based on their interests, based on their history, and based on mailing on their constituency, the people who elected them to be in the power. We have the NGOs, and here is not homogeneous. We have international environmental NGOs as Greenpeace, who is there to fight for saving the planet. We have some NGOs that are there for human rights. We have some local NGOs that could have some funds to attend the meetings to talk about artisanal fisheries. So we have many different NGOs, and they are there with different interests and purposes to be in this international arena. We have the social and environmental movements, which is different from NGOs. The social and environmental movements are pretty much more horizontal on decision-making process, and they are there to take their voice to this international arena and to fight for what they want, and to fight for what they think is right for the oceans. We have the private sector that, of course, is there to defend their business, and they are there also to influence decision makers on what they think it should be doing, they should be doing. And all of this is following, discussing, influencing, and writing the rules, norms, institutions, formal or informal, and institutional arrangements that are supposed to govern the oceans. And we have many different of them. So we are here in a moment that we are discussing how to change, how to shift from government to governance. And in governance, we have all those stakeholders that together are deciding how to manage the natural resources, the commons that we have discussed yesterday with Professor Cristiana. So this is a very complex arena because it's not simple to look to a state and say, okay, here we have a stakeholder, one stakeholder state. A state is like, it may be 193 states with different interests in one decision-making process. And they are sometimes divided between blocks, like G77, we have China plus US sometimes, we have European Union take some decisions. So we have those blocks that normally they are divided by their power and interests, and they are all in the same arena with non-state stakeholders that are there to decide and to discuss ocean governance. Going back to what we were discussing yesterday, when we talk about governance, I always like to put us under this Elinor Ostrom framework, where we have here the governance system that are influencing or causing transformation or behavior on users and in research systems, all provoking feedbacks, interactions, and outcomes. So this is the governance we are talking about the oceans, even when we are mentioning the large-scale ecosystems. Because scales, as also Christiana showed yesterday, it varies a lot from local to regional to global. And here we are talking about global, and it really impacts the decision-making process. And there are also, and Pedro Jacobi showed that yesterday, many concepts and definitions about governance, and there's no one that's right or wrong. It's just that you have to choose the one is fit better to your research question or to the research you want to do. I like to use one that is rules, norms, policies, institutional arrangement that is structuring interactions between politics, economy, and society, capable of promoting conservation of natural resources of common use. But this was not like International Relations Institute where I was. This was not really like, is this something that we should discuss? Because normally they are discussing the global governance in a very different way, because the main concern of them is not the natural resources. They are not discussing the commons in a way we are discussing here, the manage of natural resources. When we look into this governance helm, we have different arrangements, institutional arrangements that we have mentioned here before along those 2-3 days that we are here in this room together. And I bring here some examples of it. So let me just get a water here. Does anyone have a question by this point? That's why I drink my water. I'm just nervous now that I saw Jake Rice is here in the audience, and he knows much better about the topic than me. So please, Jake, feel free to add anything that I'm talking here. But we have many examples of international oceans-related agreements. So we have IMO, which is International Maritime Organizations. We have United Nations Convention Law of the Sea. We have the Convention of Biological Diversity. We have Nagoya Protocol. So all those arrangements, all those agreements that decision makers adopt in an international level, after all, has to be adopted in a national level as well. So it is not right if we say, I don't care about the international arena. I'm here in my country and my research is just here. That's not really true, because most of, or all the decisions the decision makers take in the international arena needs to be internalized and become domestic once they got back to their country. So when countries take these decisions, after all, they have to come back to their national waters and say, okay, we have international regulations, and now we need to make it work here. And this is also a problem. Sometimes we have an international decision that works more for global north, but not really necessary for the global south. And that's why sometimes some decisions are not really implemented in the countries in a homogeneous way. So those are some examples of international ocean-related agreements. Have you heard or studied any of this? Yes. So you are familiar with those agreements. Okay, good. Oops. We have a history of international environmental conference, and this goes back to mainly 1972, where we had Stockholm Conference, where myself as a Brazilian have nothing to be proud of it, because Brazil was there saying, hey, global north countries, your pollution interests to me because we want to become developed. So we want your industry here emitting CO2 as much as we want because we want to become developed. But since it is 1972 conference, many of agreements were being discussed between all those countries in this international arena. And we have a peak of it that was like about 90s, and this was like after or while the discussion on Rio 92 happened here in Brazil. It was a conference that we had like more than 300 NGOs attending the conference, and it's turning point, I would say, for the international agreements discussion, because we had here a moment where it was not like it was in the 70s, where government, states, countries were taking most of decisions. In the 90s, we have an arena full of other stakeholders influencing or trying to influence decision makers on the process. And this huge amount of treaties, protocols, amendments also brought another reality for the international, for the global arena. The world became much more interdependent, because each time a country signs an agreement with another one, be a bilateral agreement or a multilateral agreement, they are having an agreement that they work together for something. And they will be depending one to another to take decisions. So when we had this peak of international agreements here around the 90s, it was the point where the world became even more interdependent, even more globalized. Of course, I can not excuse myself to say that most of these agreements that we're taking, the decisions we're taking on global arena, when the countries have to ratify the agreements and make it work in their national continent or in their national area, we have a peak of ratification mostly on European Union area. So most international agreements we have, they are not really ratified in a homogeneous way around the planet, but most of them are focused on European Union influenced way. But for the ocean governance, we have this alphabetic soup with many acronyms that you were familiar with. So when we discuss the United Nations Convention Law of the Sea, from there, we had many agreements that were, in a way, interrelated, or that have to follow the same regulations or the same guidelines as United Nations Convention Law of the Sea. And I try to put here, in green ones, the agreements that are more oriented for conservation and scientific research. So we have here CITES, which is the International Convention for Trade in Endangered Species. I have here CMS, which is for the migratory species, Convention for Migratory Species. We have here UNEP, which is the environmental program for the United Nations. We have CDB. I have here on the other side agreements that are more focused on research and research extraction and usage. So we have international maritime organizations, we have RFMOs, which are the regional fishery management organizations, and ISA, which is the International Seabed Authority. And in blue ones are the ones who were more a mix of everything, like International Whaling Commission, which is like a commission that is in between, or it's confused about, the commission is confused about their role in the international scenario, because it was created to promoting whaling in a sustainable way, and it now is becoming a body more on conservation, so it's stuck between those two. Jake has talked a lot and in a very clear way about UNCLOS, but that is very complex. I decided to bring a little bit more on history here. So in 1903, in 1993, we have the League of Nations called a conference in The Hague to discuss national claims. The UNCLOS debate, when they were discussing to have a law of the sea, was very focused on how to divide the oceans, how we have sovereignty over the waters, because not all countries, and even now, have conditions, economic conditions, technology conditions to go further out of the sea. But in 1903, there were some nations that were already doing it. And they want to decide what were the waters that they had sovereignty. And this discussion started here in 1903, and it has a point here in 1945, where we have the Truman Proclamation, and United States extended jurisdiction of natural resources on its continental shelf. So developed nations were already thinking on how to guarantee sovereignty over waters and resources. So this, for the other nations, start to get, okay, so we have to discuss how we are going to share the resources we have in the oceans. Because before that, we were all living in this freedom of the seas that we still have for the high seas, that is changing right now with the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction agreement. But before that, we were living in a world where we had the freedom of the seas. So as much as you can get there, it was like first come, first served. So in 1956, we have the first United Nations Convention Law of the Sea, is UNCLOS first. And it's notes here that is 1956. And as the time goes on, we had like many discussions around 1965, 70s, 75, 80s, where we had UNCLOS 3. So the discussion over sovereignty, the discussion about sovereignty over the oceans, it took like 30 years between the nations to get something, an agreement that could discuss what we are doing in terms of sovereignty with our oceans. So here in the UNCLOS 3, between 1973 and 82, we have the third conference on the law of the sea with 160 participating nations. And the period for the UNCLOS 3 is also long, if you think it's from 73 and 82, almost 10 years debating what would be the law of the sea that is today known as the Constitution of the Oceans. After 82, we had an agreement in the international arena, but the countries have to ratify this agreement in their national arena to make the UNCLOS become valid. So as the time went by, we had this in 1994, so from 82 to 94, we had those countries ratifying UNCLOS in their countries, to then in 94 having this the law came into force in 16 November. So it was a very long process. But as you can imagine, we were talking about how to share the resources we have in this area that we cannot see after our eyes, and with many different powers between the nations. So how difficult it is to find what would be the law of the sea that would be great for developing countries and also for developed nations. So this took a while to get our first text agreed here in 94. So here is a summary of what we have talking. We have this third United Nations conference that took about 10 years. Then the convention entered into force in 94, and countries now who have ratified United Nations Convention Law of the Sea have regulations and guidelines to follow in their national waters. Brazil is one of them. We have ratified United Nations Convention Law of the Sea in 1986, so now our country respects that convention. In any other regulation, we approve it within the country. And the main regulation we follow here for UNCLOS, beyond the other agreements that came from United Nations Law of the Sea, is the division and the governance we have for our water. For the water, we have sovereignty. So here, from United Nations Convention Law of the Sea, we have that 12 nautical miles from your continental area is territorial waters. So in case of Brazil, and maybe in case of many countries, but some of them are much more complex in this territory. For Brazil, we have this 12 nautical miles, whereas the area that countries, coastal states, have the sovereignty to discuss what type of activities we have, how we are going to regulate, how we are going to approve. So this is all the 17 coastal states we have in Brazil. And then we have 200 nautical miles, which is the EEZ, Exclusive Economic Zone, where the country as a nation in a federal level has the sovereignty to decide what we are going to do. So no other country can come to our Brazilian 200 nautical miles and explore anything, any research, without have authorization of our country. Of course, this does not affect navigation, but when you have navigation, you have to inform why you are getting into someone's waters. And this is the 200 nautical miles that we call exclusive economic zone. After these 200 nautical miles, we have an area that is like between Brazil and South Africa, for example, which is by the UNCLOS considered the high seas, which would be right here. And the division of the area was after the continental shelf, which is today after, imagine that those divisions were made in 80s. And now we have advanced so much on technology and scientific knowledge. So we have much more on how is the continental shelf for each country. And many countries are applying and demand that they want to extend their economic exclusive zone. Brazil is also one of them. And we are pretty much advanced in this process. So every time a country wants to increase their economic exclusive zone, they have to apply for a process under International Seabed Authority with a claim and information to show that our continental shelf, it goes beyond 200 nautical miles. That was decided in 82. And approved in 94. So this is the convention, the governance we have for the oceans. We have many, many agreements, and this is just a more detailed illustration for the alphabetic soup I showed earlier. So we have here UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and then we have all those agreements that are somehow related to UNCLOS, or it was, yes?
I'm a little bit curious about this extension of the EEZ. Just want to know on which terms is this granted, this extension? I mean, I know that my country is kind of claiming for this extension, and it's still being on the discussion level for quite some time now. So I'm just curious on which terms will it be granted?
I don't know, maybe Jake knows better than me, but I am following up the process from within Brazil, and Adam also can add.
Can I simply say that I was going to touch on this afternoon?
Okay, of course you can. So can you hold your question?
Oh, yeah, sure.
In which country you were? Just curious.
Sri Lanka.
Okay, good. So Adam will talk about this later. So we have here all those conventions that were coming from United Nations Convention Law of the Sea, and then each of them has their autonomy and independence to follow their guidelines. They have their own conventions, they have their own parties, and but in a way they are following the mother convention, which is the Law of the Sea, which is known by Constitution of the Sea. It would be impossible for us in 1 hour and a half going into detail of all of this. And Jake has covered some Alan will cover some as well. So at least you are going to leave after 15 days of this course with a background on those ocean governance international agreements for the oceans. And we will be all around here if you have specific questions about those agreements, because it will be impossible to cover all of this. So I will focus on some of them. And it is now I am a bit more stressed because Jake knows regional fishery management organizations for his own experience. So I will focus on the experience I have for ICAT, which is the Atlantic Tuna Convention that I studied in my PhD. So RFMOs, as you are familiar with, are international organizations formed by countries with fishing interests in an area. Some of them manage all fish stock in a specific area, and others focus on a specific fish which are highly migratory species, like tuna. So we have here one map with the RFMOs for highly migratory fish stocks, tuna and associated species, with some examples of it. We have here the Atlantic Tuna International Convention. We have here the CCSBT for the Southern Bluefin Tuna. We have here IOTC, WCFF. So all this alphabetic soup for the oceans that are there to manage tuna fish populations are under, some of them were created before UNCLOS, some of them were created after UNCLOS, but all of them are now within a framework from the convention Jake showed you, that the United Nations Fishery Stocks Agreement, that is an implementing agreement that came from UNCLOS. In my PhD, I studied ICAT, CCSBT, and CAMELAR, but here I will present just ICAT in a specific case, just to illustrate how complex is the international arena. ICAT is today signed and formed by 52 members. This Tshirts go to 2014, but currently we have 52 members, state members. And most of those members are fisheries countries, so they are part of international convention for conservation of Atlantic tunas, but conservation here means how we can fish in a sustainable way to guarantee the research for future generations. And we have in this international arena different stakeholders with different interests, with different beliefs and values. So we have environmental NGOs, fishery industry, and scientific communities. The period I have studied was from 2004 to 2014. And my main question was, is power listening to science? So I got those 10 years period from, conventions are a really interesting study object because you have all meeting reports, all speeches that were made along the years available in their website. So it's a rich source of information and knowledge that you can use for your research, and this is good. Also for ICAT, I was lucky to realize that most stakeholders were very open to answer my questions and be interviewed for my research, so this was good. During these 10 years of research, as I came to the PhD with that questions, like we have many multilateral environmental agreements and the environmental or the status of the oceans is still declining, I would like to go more further on effectiveness of those agreements. So back in 2004, we had like advice from the scientific committee, the SCRS, recommending that the quota of the bluefin tuna, which is a specific case because ICAT have many different species that they are about to regulate. So we have here, for my study was on bluefin tuna. So we have the scientific committee since 2004 saying, hey, we have to reduce the quotas. We have to put the quotas on 15,000. And the commission decision, the countries were like having the quotas on third wish something for many years. So the scientific committee was saying reduce the quota, and the political decision was keeping the quota as the business as usual. And for a while, this started to get into media attention because the bluefin tuna is a very expensive fish. So we had this biomass for the bluefin tuna declining. And environmental NGOs got aware of that and very worried and started a campaign to save the tunas. We had media coverage about this. We have many stakeholders worry about if ICAT was really able to fulfill their role to conserve the fishery stocks. Along those years that I were monitoring for this research, the scientific committee, of course, it improved their scientific techniques. It creates a more sense of community between them because most of the scientists who were part of the scientific committee were following those meetings year by year. So they were becoming community by themselves. And they were improving their techniques, and they were improving the way they were analyzing the data. But they were very consistent with their information they were providing decision makers in this case. Sometimes we have a high level of uncertainty, but in this case, they were very, they were working hard to make the information, as Jay has pointed, legitimate, robust, and salient. So they were trying this very hard. But still, the bluefin tuna populations were declining. And the commission decision were getting the pressure from outside, from NGOs, and also from other international organizations. So we had an arena where we have all those stakeholders pay attention to the discussion on bluefin tuna and going deeper on it. So along those years, we have a very specific situation, and we don't have it for every case we look into the international arena, but we had it for tuna. What we had here? We had a moment, and it was a very specific momentum on ICAT, where we had a decision-making arena, which was the CPC, is the parts of the countries. And we had Tshirts, which is the Convention of Endangered Species, saying ICAT that ICAT was not able to fulfill their role. And if it was not able to fulfill their role, they could list bluefin tuna in Annex 1, which would put the bluefin tuna as an endangered species, and then you could not trade, you could not fish endangered species. So this was a threat from sites to ICAT, saying, hey, you have to fulfill your role. You have to listen to science. So we have this documentation all available in the ICAT website. We have here NGOs as well. And NGOs is very interesting because they are not homogeneous. So we have some NGOs that have a very scientific body, attend those conferences, not only plenary, but also on scientific community, because they have a biology or fishery background, and they have all the tools and knowledge to make the analysis about the fishery stocks and the bluefin tuna stocks. So NGOs, part of their employees, part of their individuals were doing advocacy on political arena. Part of them were part of the scientific community. And I was pretty much my goal was to identify who at the ICAT was the epistemic communities that Professor Peter Haas, since 1992, had said that epistemic community were a group of experts that share beliefs, methodology, trust, and legitimacy to discuss and to influence policy making. So I was trying to identify these epistemic communities, and I realized through interviews and report meetings that part of those employees from environmental NGOs were also part of these epistemic communities because they have this professional background. We have, of course, the scientists that were part of ICRS. And we have here, in this case, a very specific situation that is leadership, because leadership in this case was very important. So we have one scientist that have, it's a fishery scientist, that have followed ICAT for many years as part of the scientific commission. And for those years, he had all the professional backgrounds to evaluate fishery stocks, tuna fishery stocks, and for being able to be in ICAT for all those years, at some point he was invited to become the chairman of ICAT. So from the scientific and epistemic community, he got a very high-level position. So he was in a leadership position where he could back up all the information, scientific information, and take it for the decision-making arena with all power he could have in his hand. So in this case, for the Bluefin Tuna, we have a very usable knowledge, I would call, legitimate, robust, salience that were from this epistemic community formed by environmental NGOs, from this ICAT chairman, from part of scientific research that were taking the knowledge to the political arena. And not all scientists from the CRS were doing it, because epistemic communities also can just produce knowledge, and the role of SCRS is produce knowledge and advise the policy making, but also some of the scientists were doing a little bit more than that. They were going further. They were producing something that we call, and I will explain later, science diplomacy, because they were getting their knowledge, which they have in a very professional manner, and they were taking the knowledge to the decision-making arena. And when we had this, it was about 2011, 2012, the decision, the advice from the scientific commission were matched with the commission decisions. So after all the pressures from environmental NGOs, from media, the threat from sites, and after having this epistemic community very strong in producing a very robust knowledge, we came to a point where the scientific advice were accepted by the commission for many, many different variables. And after a while, the studies could show that we had increased the biomass of bluefin tuna, and it still goes on. So this is a very, does not happen always. We have many different characteristics in the stakeholders, specific stakeholders in this specific case. It's a snapshot. It's a 10 years of one debate about one species in one convention. But we have all these variables, all this context is specific that show that when power listens to science, we can improve effectiveness of this agreement. Any question by this point? No question? Okay. And we have many others agreement that I would like to point here. We have the regional seas program conventions that are many countries, 140 countries that are promoting sustainable management and use of marine and coastal environmental, and that they are looking for fulfill their action plan that will be addressing the sustainable development goals. That will be a topic of call, I guess, tomorrow. We have the CDB, which is a history of looking for conserve the biodiversity in the national waters. And under the CBD, we have these ecological, biological significant areas. And these EBSAs, have you heard about EBSAs before? Who has heard about EBSAs before? Jake, you don't. So EBSAs, it was special areas that were defined by different criteria, like uniqueness, special importance, importance for threatened and endangered, vulnerability, fragility, biological productive, biological diversity, naturalness. And those identified areas were made by how EBSAs are identified. Are identified by national states using the best available scientific cooperations between states. And this is the EBSAs maps we have available now. It's on the CDB website. Some of them are on national waters, and of course, as oceans do not respect the geopolitical limits, we have some of them that goes over limits, and that's why we have to discuss this in the international arena. But besides we have those EBSAs defined, as I mentioned, UNCLOS said that each country has sovereignty over 200 nautical miles, but we have 64 ocean areas that is called high seas, and that we have no agreement, at least so far, ratified and agreed, for the high seas area. And that's why, since 1994, a group of experts and political stakeholders were, since 1994, as a recommendation by United Nations General Assembly, working on are being part of a working group and discussing along 10 years to have biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction agreements that will cover and regulate the use of biodiversity over the waters where countries have sovereignty. And in 2017, after all those 10 years working on what would be this draft of an international legally binding agreement where countries has to comply with, they decided to launch an intergovernmental negotiation committee in 2007 to then start to discuss with policymakers what would be this agreement. And BBNJ is the brand new agreement that is a very interesting case for study, because we have this package that Jake has mentioned before, which includes capacity building, basically from developed countries for developing nations. We have environmental impact assessment. We have area-based management tools that would be like MPAs in international waters. And we have this very complex topic for marine genetic resources and the sharing of benefits. All those 4 years has to be part or components of this new agreement that will probably be discussed, that it will be discussed along next years and probably be approved in the next years as well. But when we come to this arena, we have conflict between countries. So I had research on report meetings from those 10 years, and I noticed that we have some countries like Europe, Chile, Australia, New Zealand, that are pro-regulation. They want to have an international legally binding agreement on the high seas, but very strong on regulation. And we have some other countries like Norway, New Zealand is divided between those two, and Japan, that want regulated, but they don't think a new agreement may be necessary. We could do this regulation and regional fishery management organizations. And we have some other countries that are more in a favor of marine genetic resources regulations, like Brazil, Mexico, Costa Rica, and the CARICOM community. In the opposition of it, that is, we want a minimum regulation, that we have Japan, United States, and Russia, that is, run for your lives. You can go and use as much as you want from the oceans with minimal regulations. So this discussion is very complex on international arena, because marine genetic resources is something now that it values, economic values a lot, because all the polymetallics nodules that we have, all minerals we have in a seabed. It's what we use now to produce cell phones, computers, and all the technological products we have in our hands right now. So it's a very big deal for business and for economic development. In some countries already have access because they have technology to get in there. In some countries, some nations do not have, and they want to share. And not only minerals, we have also substances that are very good to produce pharmaceutical products. And this is also a big deal for companies. So we have this complex system with policy fragmentation, scientific uncertainty, low engagement from society, marine litter, overfishing, and pollution, all of this in our oceans under the climate change impacts. So it's not easy. And when we look to the UNFCCC, which is the last agreement that I need to present before I open to questions, we have even more complexity added here, because most of oceans community are not following the climate. Because besides we recognize that climate change is impacting the oceans, our community is not really into there. because we have many other conventions to follow up, so it's difficult to be everywhere. But climate change is a very a big thing, and that we have plenty of evidence that is causing impact. We have an increasing of CO2 emissions. We have deforestation. That's a big deal for Brazil. We have plastic pollution. We have agricultural practices that are not really sustainable. And then for all those reasons, UNFCCC were created in 1992 in that big boom of multilateral environmental agreements that went to Kyoto Protocol, and now we have the latest one, which is the Paris Agreement. When we look to that, we can see that climate change is provoking many different extreme events. So we have sea level rise, we have drought, we have floods, we have extreme events, and this picture is from Santa Catarina here in Brazil, one of our first hurricane we have here that we cannot, of course, link it to climate change, but we can say that after all this change period that we are living on, it's provoking more extreme climate change events. We have lack of quality of life for many communities, which are facing drought, for example. We have ice melting. And we have oceans, which are the good guy, but also the victim of climate change. Because as you know, many of my colleagues from the laboratory are from the oceanographic background. We know oceans has a very important role on the carbon cycle and on the climate change cycle as well. Because oceans are being impacted by climate. So we have ocean acidification, we have coral bleaching, we have change on migratory patterns from the fish stocks. So oceans are being impacted, but we are also a very good guy, oceans I mean. Why? Because they also works as a carbon sink. But, and it is, Hoffley estimates that oceans can absorb around 30% of anthropic CO2 emissions. But where is the problem with it? We have lots of threats. So we have here coral bleaching picture from a friend of mine, Alcides Fagundes, in Abrolhos National Marine Park, which is a coral reef area we have in Brazil. We have ocean acidification, coral bleach, sea level rise. And when the United Nations UNFCCC was signed and discussed, they have included here that as part of this agreement, sinks and reservoirs of all greenhouse has to be protected, ocean as well. But when we move into this negotiation, we have 2015 Paris Agreement, just 3 years ago, and no mention to ocean as a carbon sink was made. We have here in Brazil our national climate change policy, and no mention was made for the ocean as a carbon sink. We have as adaptation or mitigation, but not as a carbon sink. We are looking more into the forests, but not into the oceans. So oceans are in this United Nations Convention for Climate Change, but a little bit on the margin of the discussion, because we are more talking about the sea level rise, the impacts oceans are suffering for climate change, but we are not looking into the oceans as a carbon sink, which could be a good point to look from the impact of view, but also from the alternatives. And UNFCCC is a very famous convention, much more than RFMOs, much more than CAMELAR for Antarctic. When you go to CAMELAR meeting, you have no or almost no NGO protesting or marching for protecting the Antarctic. Of course, CAMELAR works very well as well, but UNFCCC, you have much more exciting protests and involvement of civil society, because the issue, it matters for much more people. So we have these examples of actions that we have around UNFCCC discussions, like Stop Climate Crime, climate just, listen to people, not polluters. So it makes this convention environment much more complex in terms of stakeholders and actors that are following those meetings. And this is also affects the decisions, or are made to affect the decisions around climate change. And we have environmental NGOs like Greenpeace protesting to go beyond offshore oil exploration. So global governance of the oceans has this characteristic that we have discussed since we came here. It's fragmented, complex, is a patchwork of norms and many soft laws. And when I mean soft laws is that they are not binding. They are not really, they are more a letter of commitment than really binding with sanctions and enforcement. And we have different interests and power relations. What are the challenges we have ahead of us here in this room? Many of them. We should work for have rules in the process with absolute majorities. We have accountability and legitimacy and equity and justice. And as much as we have the social capital, the stakeholders involved in the process, as much as we can guarantee actual justice influencing the decision-making process. We have also to think how we are going to make coastal communities, local problems get into international arena. Because when we come back to our country, to our local scales, we see that we have impoverishment of the coastal population, loss of biological diversity, overfishing, and altered food chains and bioevasion. So how we get all our issues in a national scales and get into international arena? We have even more activities going even further out of the oceans. Navigation, exploration, pollution, and even more poorly regulated exploitation of biological and mineral resources that we want to change with the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction agreements. Lack of enforcement and compliance, and inadequate environmental remediations process. And together with that, just to add a little bit more of complexity, the world population is growing. It's growing to probably 10 billion of people. So how we are going to end poverty, how we are going to end food hunger, where we have these goals in the Sustainable Development Goals, how we are going to address it, protecting the oceans and keeping the oceans stable. This is a challenge we have ahead of us. So for the future, we should think about controlling the anthropic action for this dramatic period I am calling here Anthropocene. We have to work for having coordination of coastal countries with the international community, manage the connection with natural social systems, as we are talking here about social ecological system in a larger scale, which is much more complex. In order to make this, make our discussion and reflection a little bit deeper, there are some components that I like to think as important in this international arena. First of all, leaders. Leadership, states or individuals, are very important on these multilateral agreements because they can bring knowledge and their influence to change decision-making process. We need to think that concepts are political constructions, and it results on power relations. So as much knowledge as we have, we need to keep in our mind that the power relations in the international arena is very power by the end. So they have many interests that are not on our eyes, or sometimes is not clear on the table. So we have to learn how to deal with that. We have interdependency between the states. Society, of course, must be engaged, and science must be taken into account in all levels. Here I just want to mention that we have these SDGs that will be discussed further tomorrow by the other professor. But for the oceans, we should not focus on only SDG 14, because we have Sustainable Development Goals 14, that's life underwater. We should make connections between all those goals eradication of poverty, food security, energy, ecosystem, and biodiversity, to promote integration about them. And try to promote effective governance, where we have resources and the use of resources by humans, monitor it and enforce it. This is a very important component. Communities maintain frequent face-to-face communication. We are in a very digital world, but trustability, it is created when we have those meetings. And that's why international arena for negotiations, conventions are important. Because it's there when you create connections between the stakeholders and you create trust between them to be able to influence decisions. So in this filter, what we need to do? We need to change the mechanism we have lived, which was first come, first served, for a place, a governance arena where we share responsibilities, values, costs and risks, and give equitable access to and allocations to the ocean services. That would be the future we want for the oceans. And it could not be different if we talk to an audience like we have here with graduate students that are here to become much more interdisciplinary. So I would like to drop those terms, that is a science for diplomacy, science in diplomacy, and diplomacy for science. Because I really think, as a scientist, we have to take our role on the political arena. Because we have the knowledge, we know what we have to do, we know how it could be better, but we don't know many times how to make our knowledge to be worth. So science and diplomacy should be merging terms. So we have international engagement through science to develop, sustain, enhance relationships between countries. That would be important. In a few years, you may be in a position to discuss scientific cooperation agreements. You may be in a position to provide advice for your country decision maker, for him be able to go there, because international negotiations, they are not able to take decisions and to know about the many topics they have to position the country in the international arena. So you may be in this position. Or science in diplomacy, which is just a matter of different concepts, but global issues with science bases and scientific and technical aspects for formal diplomatic process. So you may be in this position as well, or even you may be a formal diplomatic searching for scientific goals. So I think as a scientist, we have to think a little bit further and try to make our knowledge a little bit, not strong, but a little bit clear and legitimate to make the decision-making process better. Because when power listens to science, we can really improve the ocean health aspects. And for that, we have many different scientific panels. And I'm not going further into details. Some of them were mentioned here before, like IPBS. Alan will talk about the World Ocean Assessment. I will just show them here to keep in your mind. And of course, you are going to have my PowerPoint presentation before, so it's nice to have here, like the Global Environmental Outlook, which produce environmental assessment about the state of the world. Have you heard about GEO? Anyone heard about GEO before? Thanks, we have two. Well, I was invited to join the Jake team for the Global Environmental Outlook version 6. It exists since 1997, and I strongly recommend you could Google it and go to UNEP website to take a look, because it's lots of good information about the environmental assessment, about the state of the environment in the world, and then you can, and they have summary for policymakers as well. So lots of great information here. GEO 6 is not launched, but will be soon. So you can be in a position also to be part of the scientific panels with your knowledge and with your professional background. So we have GEO, we have IPBS that Jake and Chris presented yesterday. We have a World Ocean Assessment that Alan will present in the afternoon. We have IPCC for climate. If oceans are not really taken into account as a carbon sink, Maybe it's because we are not there showing there the importance of oceans in this process. So we have to occupy those spaces to promote science and policy interface in all levels. Here I have a pictures of United Nations General Assembly, but it does not be just international. It can be global. It can be regional, local. We have to occupy the spaces where the decisions are making because we have the knowledge to influence the decision-making process. And for me, the future is where we want to be. And we should fight for that. And so this is the hope message I want to leave by the end of this presentation, because I really think we have here a group of people that are able to go further our skills in our scientific community to really promote science and policy interface. And that's it. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? Do we have time? I don't know what time are we. 10 minutes. 10 minutes? Do we have questions? And if I don't know how to answer, I will recall to my support here called Jake Rice, which has much more experience on it than me.
Hello, I'm Lorena from Brazil. Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Lorena. I'm from Brazil. And this is all very new to me. I've never worked with these things before. And you said something very interesting and that we really know about it, that to make the an effective governance, we need to make our policies, our treaties, our laws to work. And to do that, we need like law enforcement. And as far as I know, in Brazil, this is a very weak point. The agencies we have, they don't work because most of the times they don't have the equipment, they don't have the tools to do it. When they have enough people to do it, they can't because they don't have the necessary equipment to do it. And I know that, I also know that the fisheries in Brazil, we don't know what's being fished. We don't know what's being landed. And what's your opinion? What do you think about we in this scenario, and we wanting to have more restricted laws to control this, and we can even make the ones that we have to work. What do you think about this scenario, like our position now? Do you have a positive opinion? Do you think this will change in a short future? How is it going to work?
Thank you for this question. It's a very great question. Especially in Brazil, we are facing a very difficult period in terms of political context. I used to have a boss that explained to me where I look at a situation, I should have very pessimist in my analysis and very optimist in my actions. So I'm like guided by this process. So I'm a very optimistic person in my actions. Brazil were embarrassed in the last ICAT meeting because they could not report their data. We have been lacking fishery statistics since 2009, and this is very clear in the international process. It's not good for the country. We have some sanctions. We have enforcement on international levels. And of course, it can be improved. But countries still have their rights to do not do that, but they have to do, but they will suffer sanctions from the international community. In terms of fisheries, there is no other way if we don't know what we have underwater to make policy decisions. We have to change it. And the way of change, of course, is a big thing like change our political context. We have election coming, so this is part of our role to choose better candidates that can change. Of course, there are not so many options, but we have to. A very, very tough job to do. But we also can occupy those spaces if we think it would be great for us, or if we could perform better in this role as a candidate for the future. But also, sometimes I try to think that the people who are in the public, as a public servants, they have some skills, but they don't have all skills. So I'm always trying to offer help if they need me. Because sometimes, as I am a postdoctoral research, I have my research to do. I have funds for my research, thanks to FAPESP. But I can also offer, in a voluntary basis, my knowledge for the decision-making process. So I think this is what we can do in Brazil at this moment. We could look for congressmen. We could look for the people on environmental ministry or fisheries secretary to send our data to contribute to their work, or even send an email to say, hey, you should do that because it could be better. And they will listen or they will not. But one day, you may be in a key position that we will be able to influence or to help someone to take a decision. And that will make all the difference. So that's what I believe. But we are facing a very difficult period. And I guess Leopoldo, a friend of mine, will present a little bit of this network. Mari is also very active on this. And I strongly believe that networks are also a way of promoting the science and policy interface and the knowledge to action. Because it's very difficult to be everywhere. It's very difficult to be where the decisions are making, but through the networks, we can infiltrate the systems and be where we have to provide knowledge. So I guess Leo will talk a little bit about this, but myself, Mariana, Leopoldo, Bianca is not here right now, but we have many people who are part of this Ombudsperson of the Sea, which is Ouvidoria do Mar in Brazil, and we are trying to look for these opportunities to interact with other sectors to provide knowledge. You are more than welcome to join.
Hi, I'm Amami from Sri Lanka. Well, I actually have 3 questions, but I don't know whether it's fair to ask all the 3 at the same time. So I'll just go with... Okay. Well, my first one is like, it's very general, technical. I just want to know the criteria we use, or the scientific community uses to define the Anthropocene epoch from Holocene epoch. How do we say that we have moved to Anthropocene from Holocene? On which basis?
In a very this is very complex. I mean, scientifically, I would not be in a position to go deeper on the methodology, but the criteria, the general one, is that the human alterations we are doing in the Earth is provoking change that will not be changed anymore, that will be permanent change in a geological layer. So they have evidences that the way we are treating Earth, the way we are developing ourselves is making change that will not be able to reverse. So when we have this change that will not be able to reverse, and that is making marks that are permanent in geological layers, then we change the epoch. But this is very polemic for the geologist community. And that's why in the last conference in 2016, they have not taken decisions to say formally we are in a new epoch.
Okay, if there's no one else, can I ask the second one as well?
Is there anyone else?
Yeah, okay.
There's one more there.
We actually had one more there. But Leandra will be with us after the break, so you can leave some questions for the next part, okay?
Okay. Actually, you have to stand with me for 15 days, so
Yeah.
I will not run away. You have to.
Hi. First, I want to thank you. This lecture was really inspiring. And second, I know there is a gap between what you're learning at the university and I think we're just writing papers and essays and just study science in our mini world. And I don't think there is a strong connection between what we are learning and writing in this society. You said I think it was the last slide, the society has to be more engaged with all of this. And I think there is a gap between what you're doing at university and what are we actually practicing in society. Like we're not engaging the society, not even with the university's affairs, and not even with politics and society. It's completely lost when we're talking about environment. And I would like to know if you have a recipe to engage the society or to bridge this gap.
No, I don't have the recipe, unfortunately. If I do, I think it would worth millions. But no, from my experience, and I had those 8 years working on NGOs that are doing their work as campaign to engage society on environmental things. And it is a challenge. I think scientific community is changing a lot for the past probably 20 or 10 years. Now we are much more discussing citizen science. We are much more discussing research, interdisciplinary research. We are becoming this like interdisciplinary little monsters that probably scientific university do not accept very well. That's true. When you want to apply for a position in the university, you have to be a very scientific person. They will not really take into account all the extra work you are doing to engage the society or to make your science and diplomacy work. So it's a big deal for us. But I think we are changing. So we have all those new way of doing our research involving society, working with community-based initiatives, involving those communities in our work. And I have some very good examples in our laboratory. You can after talk to Luciana about our work on the beaches projects where it was built with society. So this is really involving society on scientific process. But apart from those research aspects, I think we have enough knowledge to translate our scientific work in a very clear way. And we should talk to our neighbors. We should talk to our friends and see if our message can navigate through the different words. This is what I try to do.
So let's leave the other questions for the next part, okay? And now we have a break to stand up and stretch your legs.